So you will see from your syllabus that this week we are talking about bias. And I specifically call it bias and not anti-racism or something else like that because when I was thinking about this material, I wanted to give you something different from the module that is offered to all law students and take a bit of a step back and look at the ideas of bias from a higher level or a more global level and take a little deeper dive into the concept of bias itself, what it is, what it does to us, where it came from. And I think it's really helpful as an overall concept because we can get really wrapped up in a lot of the minutia of what's happening every single minute. But there are a lot of grounding principles that people have been trying to figure out for generations, for millennia, really, that will help us navigate a lot of what's happening in the world usually. So anti-racism, cultural humility, and belonging is critically important. I am absolutely on board with as much of that as possible, but right now I wanted to look at bias in particular because I think bias helps it helps create injustice when it is used. If bias persists, it also can affect our own well-being. It is harmful on the macro and micro level. So I want to tell you a little bit what I'm thinking about for this week, and then I will explain the assignments to you. So in a pure sense, bias in general is built in to our most ancient brain functions. So if you think of us as more primitive humans before we started reading philosophy and doing really high level things, we have this knee-jerk reaction, right? And it was a survival tactic. So basically we would be hunter-gatherers and we would be walking around in nature and we would see a shape. And that shape was a threat. It was something that we had learned was a threat. So let's say it was a long green tube in the grass, right? Most likely it was a snake when we were hunter-gatherers, right? That's what would be there. And if we didn't run or kill the snake or do something to react to the snake, it was life or death for us. The knee-jerk reaction was there for a reason. We didn't have a lot of time to think about the snake. And was it a snake or was it a root or was it a piece of rope? All we could do was run. So we have moved on from then, and there were a lot of things that could be long green tubes in the grass, including, our garden hose that we just used. But we still have that primitive brain. We still have that knee-jerk reaction. It's still part of our very, very basic cognitive function. And so we may still have a fight or flee or fight or flight response if you see something. And it's not just a long tube, but all sorts of things will trigger that kind of knee-jerk reaction. So, if we have the opportunity now that we're not in such a dangerous physical place, that we can take a moment and look for the details of our situation. Is the snake moving? Does it have markings? Does it look like it has eyes? Right? Oh, it doesn't. Oh, it's my hose. Right? We have the room for those snap judgments to turn into thoughts and reasoning. Then that is really where we have evolved to. And so in a place where the outcomes are more harmless, and we have time to think about them, then our bias, our proclivity towards a bias, and what I'm going to call the knee-jerk reaction, is something that we actually have the luxury now to take a moment with. And our society has gotten so complicated that knee-jerk reaction that used to save our lives is now sort of misplaced sometimes in a lot of our interactions. And so there's a lot of places where if we are able to just give ourselves the tools for that pause and for that reflection and that sort of second look at a situation after the knee-jerk reaction, then that's what a lot of the work in bias is about. But in terms of what we're doing this week, I've picked some articles talking about the concept of bias. Now, there are probably hundreds of types of bias. If you look up types of bias. You're going to find an adjective next to bias, and there's many, many of them. So I made a decision to just pick a few sort of very simple, obvious ones that have a tie into law. So we're going to talk about their cognitive biases. So we're going to talk about survivorship bias and confirmation bias. And the articles that you have get into those. But just so you know, the scholarship around bias or the inquiry into the idea of bias or our ability to re-examine our surroundings to discover what's really happening goes back beyond Plato, beyond Aristotle, beyond they wrote it down, but people have been trying to figure out how to do this probably for as long as we've been thinking. If you have ever studied Plato's allegory of the cave, that's what that's about. Plato, basically said, imagine he had a thought experiment. Imagine we all lived in a cave where all we could see was the cave lit by firelight. And that was our only perception of the world. And we had no other way to perceive the world beyond the cave lit by firelight. We wouldn't know anything. Our perception would be limited to just that view until we stepped out of the cave and were able to examine more fully what it was that we were seeing. So when you see, when you are able to step back or step outside the cave and look at what it is that's driving our knee-jerk reactions, or the things that are driving us to a decision that are not thought-driven, that are not reasoning-driven, then you will find that there are places where it crops up all the time. And so some of the places that you are going to see that that are not in our reading, but you'll see it all the time in other trainings are, for example, you will see studies that have done with resumes, and they've done studies where they've changed the names on the exact same resume so that one name was a very plain European-based name, and another one was a name that had its origin in a Asian or African tradition. And there were different outcomes for the owners of that, or the fictional owners of that resume, right? The people with the European names were given more favor as the resumes were evaluated. They were granted more interviews, or they were forgiven for more typos and all sorts of things. There's also studies done, and there's actually been policies made on orchestras that have tried to combat the fact that they didn't have very many women. This was going on 20 years ago, and thought about whether or not it was because when the auditions happened, the adjudicators would just automatically assume women weren't as good as a musician as men were, and therefore scored them more harshly, or perceived more mistakes from the women because they were expecting them. They already expected them to make mistakes when they walked in by virtue of them being women. And so to prove that, or to try to combat that hypothesis, a lot of orchestras decided to make their auditions blind, meaning the audition was done without the adjudicators actually seeing the musicians, to the point where I think they had the musicians not wear shoes, so that they couldn't tell even by hearing whether the person would step behind a screen but was wearing heels or not. And so that you would give it away that it was likely going to be a woman if she were wearing high heels. And they did find that more women were admitted into orchestras after the auditions became, after they made them blind, before you couldn't see the person who was playing the music. And so there's a lot of places, very, very famous places, where bias has made an impact. And it seems like a very simple thing, but once it's studied, you see that that impact is happening in a very real sense, and it can make real harm. It's not just, oh, knee-jerk reaction didn't bother anyone. It's really impact someone's life in a way. And you'll see that in law. So when you read the articles, you'll see, but it will affect your case. So there will be times when in case management, if you come in, we talk about one of the things in the articles is confirmation bias. So that's what we're talking about. You already have a sense um, before the case starts or before you know anything about your client, whether you think it's going to be a good case or whether or not you think the client is telling you the truth or they did the crime or whatever. You have a preconceived notion based on that knee-jerk reaction, right? You already know it's a snake, right? So you may affect whether you even take a case. Well, I don't want any of those cases that come in from that place, right? I don't want anybody whose profile looks like that. I don't want landlords from that neighborhood, or I don't want business owners who, sell certain things. So it may start off right there, whether you take a case or not. It could also affect what you do with the case. Do you plead down? Do you go to trial? What do you do? How much faith do you have in your client? Do you, fight harder for some clients than you do for others? How about witnesses? When you interview witnesses, do you believe all of them? Do you believe some of them too much? Do you ask enough critical questions to some and not enough of others? Based on something visceral in you, a gut feeling or whatever you want to call it, that is telling you that person's trustworthy and that other person isn't. Where is that coming from? Is it possible there's a bias at work, and should it be examined? Is there data that you are collecting at your law office, whether it's in the for-profit or nonprofit sector? Are we collecting the right information that we need? Are we looking at, are there certain swaths of the population that are not coming to our organization for help? Why would that be? What's keeping them away? Or did we forget to ask that question because we don't think about that population? Why not? Because we perceive our clients as looking a certain way or being from a certain background, or we have a bias towards a certain type of work. And so all of that turns into policy. All of that turns up and becomes very, very big societal issues. So definitely take a look at how there are two confirmation bias articles. One is in the private sector, one is at the Innocence Project, that really talk about that. The other one is not about law at all, but it is about survivorship bias, which is really interesting, I think, just in terms of the concept of bias in a very pure sense. It has nothing to do really with even with people, but the idea that bias can also affect our ability to analyze data because of just what data we're choosing to look at. So without changing the conversation or giving you the ending, like I don't want to like spoil it for you, but basically the idea is that researchers oftentimes will only study companies that were successful, but they don't gather any data from companies that weren't successful, when maybe that's the data we need. So survivorship bias is we only know what happened to the survivors. We only know what happened to the successful ones. Nobody's asked what happened to people who failed or the ones that broke, or the items that were brought in for repair, but what about the items that were thrown away? So it has nothing to do with people, but it's still a bias that affects a lot of the data, a lot of the advice that people might give, or a lot of the you can imagine how that data spins off into lending and getting businesses off the ground, all sorts of things. So those are the two parts of the first part of the reading, which is really to just look at the bias concept in general. So that's the critical thinking part. So that's the first part of the assignment. I see my job as really helping you to become great lawyers, great advocates, giving you as many tools as possible to do justice, whatever sector that's going to be in and whatever that means to you. And I do desperately want that to be in an anti-racist way. But the roots of getting that outcome are grounded in critical thinking, I believe. And they're also grounded in self-regulation and emotional intelligence. They're grounded in our ability to take a breath when we feel that knee-jerk reaction coming on, not just when we're going to say something to someone, but also when we're examining everything. So the beginning of that conversation starts off with those two concepts of bias in the article. So that's where the critical thinking piece looks like. In this semester, I've also added a link to the University of Wisconsin has a page on how to recognize bias in studies, in all kinds of different media. It's not so much to be read, but just as a resource. And it's great for passing along to people, especially if you know people who you are constantly like trying to convince you that some sort of, you know, unexamined framework is like great, you know. And it's a good way to say, well, you know, who's the writer of that? Who's making money off of that? Who's trying to convince you of that? Who benefits when you believe that? Let's think critically about whether that's really what's going on. And so it's a really nice collection of resources for critical thinking. So I've added that in there just for your reference. So read the articles, think about how cognitive bias in some form has the potential to affect the kind of work you're doing at your placement. I've given you some prompts to help you think that through. And hopefully also just to give us all the same grounding. So when we talk about bias, you know, all the different things it could mean and all the ways that it can be handled. Then the second part is kind of the fun half, I think. It's the self-regulation. This is where we put it into practice. And it's going to be a little bit of a, you know, sort of a muscle flex sort of for an exercise for us all to try. So what I mean by self-regulation or emotional intelligence is the practice of getting used to noticing and examining your own reactions and emotions and figuring out what to do with them. So if you have that knee-jerk or visceral reaction to the way something makes you feel, even in a micro way, like for a split second, it's that ability to first notice it. A lot of us just like feel it and just assume it's you know, there, it's part of my day, I didn't even think of it. But if you notice it, like, ooh, you know, I had that feeling, I got that, I just assumed that was going to be that way, I thought that was going to happen and it didn't. So notice those things, and then also think about where it comes from, see if it's appropriate or helpful in your situation. So it's like saying, ooh, there's a coiled up green thing in the grass. Ooh, and then going, wait, I just recoiled at that green thing. Let me look at it. Is it really gonna hurt me? Are there eyes on it? Is it moving? Is it a hose? Because it kind of looks like a snake, but I don't think it is. So it's that kind of the ooh is okay. This is something that you can exercise. This is something that you can practice regularly noticing that knee jerk is happening. Now, remember, we don't have any control over the knee jerk happening. So let me just say the key to all of this is to let it happen and just notice it and deal with it. But you can't beat yourself up for having a knee jerk, right? That's the primitive lizard brain that I was talking about. Okay, so the second part of the assignment is to watch a video of your choice. I've loaded a whole bunch of videos into UB Learns. One is a podcast, so if you like those, that's an option. And they are broad examples of people sharing their lived experience. So, and they're all people who we might consider being in a protected class or an underserved or underrepresented group, a group that tends to experience some sort of bias regularly, or has things about their life that are generally unusual. They tend to be people who have different experiences from other people. So it is the opportunity, I would imagine there's going to be at least one video that every person in the class probably would look at and have some sort of knee-jerk reaction to. And by that I mean, without judgment, look at what your reaction is, like, oh, wow, I didn't know that existed. Or it could be ick, right? Ugh. Do it without judgment though, right? It could be ick, but oh, I can't believe I just noticed that I was kind of disgusted by that. That I feel horrible now. No, the knee-jerk reaction is what it is, right? The beauty in it is noticing it and then looking at it. So pick one. I tried to pick a lot of people so that there would be a variety. I put a label on the beginning of each video that just sort of gives you, and I did this on purpose, a broad category of one of those protected classes or groups so that you can easily tell, because you can't always tell from the name of their video, sort of what they represent. So one of them is a deaf blind law student. Another one is a disability rights activist who uses a wheelchair. Another one is a queer autistic comedian. Okay, so things like that where you can sort of tell immediately, oh, I may pick that one because I don't know anything about that category. That category gave me the biggest knee-jerk reaction as I was skimming through for whatever reason. So go ahead and pick one. And you're welcome to watch all of them. But you're going to do your reflection on one. And what I really want you to do is just reflect on how you're feeling as you watch it. So these are all fairly well-known people. They've done TED Talks, or they've been on television, or they have books, they have public-facing lives. So you can dive more into their stories. If the person is really touching to you or you really loved listening to them, I've put more material in a separate folder that might have their book or a movie about them or something in it. So there is more. That's not required. That's just for you to chase down if it wants. But basically, when you're reading this, watching the short media, the mostly videos about the one person, what I want you to do is sort of a version of mindfulness, which is the notice what you're noticing. So notice your knee-jerk reaction. Try to sort of process it, figure out what it is. What are you feeling? What was your reaction? Think about what it is. What assumptions are you making right now? Did you expect them to talk a certain way, be dressed a certain way, have a certain attitude towards something? Maybe there was a topic it said they were going to talk about, and you expected them to have a certain angle on it that, maybe they had or maybe they didn't. So think about, what are you expecting as you launch into this person? What are your impressions as you start to watch or listen to them? And continue to just, without judgment, don't judge yourself, right? Just watch. Try to figure out, what am I thinking? What are my reactions? Where do I think they're coming from? When am I surprised? Right? What surprised me? What totally turned this on my head? It was not what I expected at all. I really thought that person was going to be more what, right? And they're not. Or I thought that person was going to say something that was what, or not. So there's no expectation, just a thorough and honest examination of your initial uncontrolled perceptions, where they might come from, whatever whether the facts of the story bear them out, whether you still hold on to them at the end. Okay. And that's what your reflection is going to be on. And by the way, this is completely confidential. So no one is going to see this but me. I'm the only one that can really see it. And even from that point of view, I'm really only grading it for completion. I may look at it, but I am not grading it or judging it. I'm doing the same thing as I read these as you're doing, which is just my only concern is whether you seem to have done it thoughtfully. The content of what you write is not something I'm making a judgment about. So certainly if you want to follow up and talk to me about any of it, I'm perfectly happy to say more with you or to have a conversation, but I'm not at all in this to sort of figure out who's saying what about whom. It's very much exercise for you to do, and the reflection is really just a tool for you to guide you through that process. So what I hope that this will do is this will be inspiring to you. It'll give you a safe place to practice. Checking your bias is something that takes time. It's not easy. For some of you, this is going to seem like really, really basic, baby steps. I can't believe, what do you think? I don't know anything. And for others, it may open your eyes more. Maybe the first time you've really seen people with from the backgrounds that you're seeing in these videos. What I will tell you is it's never a wrong time to practice. You can never learn everything. You're never going to know everything. I researched a lot of videos. I watched all of these and more as I was curating these videos for you. And with all the years that I have taught, um, emotional intelligence topics, I've been in DEI spaces, I've trained management on self-regulation, all of this stuff. I have a long street cred in even teaching this material. I learned something from every single one of these videos. I really grew my capacity for being empathetic to people every time I watch one. So this is a way to just say, here's a new one. Here's one you haven't seen before. And here's another day to practice. Just that walking back of the knee-jerk reaction. Take a breath. Where is that coming from? Notice that it happened. Have some appreciation then for the surprise. There's kind of a thrill in seeing, like, oh, I was wrong. Look at what just happened. That's actually a really beautiful moment. And to me, it's always it's like the twist in a movie, I guess, or the moment you think that the person that's been setting up to be the murderer in a movie was the hero all along. So they're wonderful moments. So I hope you do enjoy them. Keep finding ways to be self-reflective as you do this. It might just give you some sort of practice and some muscle memory then for doing it in other places. So keep on going after this week. And certainly if you want to watch more of the videos, please do. And if you have other videos that or people that you think would be fun to include in this group, let me know. I'd love to include them. Or if you really have one that you've stumbled across that you want to use for your reflection, you can do that. Just, give me a link to it so I can see it as well. But that's fine. I mean, don't go to the work of finding one. You have plenty to choose from. But if you have one you feel really strong about, definitely feel like you can use that. So I hope you enjoy this week. I find these, there's a lot of, everyone in the world is an inspiration. So really, these ones happen to be on YouTube. But listen to stories, listen to other people's stories. Here's a few for you to practice with. I really think if you keep doing it, you will ultimately become a better lawyer. You'll be a better counselor, advocate. You'll even be a better friend, family member, citizen, human. So for this week, that's it for me. I hope you have a lovely holiday if you celebrate, and I will talk to you the next time. Bye.